Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author Jesse Wegman, and he'll be talking about his new book, The Lost Founder, James Wilson and the Forgotten Fight for a People's Constitution. Jesse, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Jesse, you're a first-time guest here on the JAR podcast. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I am not a historian. I am a journalist. I worked last 30 years. I've been working as a journalist for daily papers and radio. The last 12 years, I was on the editorial board at the New York Times. And now I'm a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I write about Supreme Court reform, constitutional reform, the little things. And before that, I worked at National Public Radio, The Atlantic, Reuters, a whole slew of places. And I did go to law school in the middle of all that in the early 2000s, which was a wonderful experience that I'm still paying off.
Well, Jesse, I'm a fan of all of those outlets. I'm familiar with your work. I'm really happy that you're here. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, I like to talk to writers about inspiration. So many of our listeners are writers, certainly readers. What inspired you to write this book, James Wilson?
Yeah, I was writing my previous book on the Electoral College. It's called Let the People Pick the President. It was a history of, and then an argument for abolishing the Electoral College, or at least finding a way to make it work in favor of majority rule. And I was at the part of the book where I needed to identify that moment where the founders, the framers of the Constitution, choose the Electoral College as a way to pick a president. And so I'm reading through James Madison's notes on the convention, and I keep running into this guy, this Scottish guy, this long-winded, Scot, who keeps talking about popular sovereignty and political equality. And, he argues early in the convention, he says, we should be electing the president by popular vote. Like this is unremarkable to him, right? The president should be a single person, should be elected popularly. And there's crickets in the room, right? That's Madison records a considerable pause, he calls it, after Wilson says all this, because nobody knows what to say or think. They're all uncomfortable with it, but Wilson is totally comfortable with it. To Wilson, this is all part of his larger worldview that he's been developing, in the years before, which put people at the center of government. And he stays committed to this more than any other founder. And that was what struck me so much. I was really taken with him, and I couldn't believe that there was a founder like this. I was embarrassed because while not a historian, I did go to law school. I was writing for a major national newspaper about the Supreme Court and constitutional law. And I thought, wow, how do I know James Wilson? And then I start asking around, and nobody else knows who he is either. And the story that I tell, which is sort of what was the ultimate catalyst for the book, was that I was at this event, a sort of a brunch event with a lot of legal bigwigs, and I'm standing in line with my plate at the buffet table, and I hear behind me a sitting Supreme Court justice, a very distinctive voice, and I turn around and I was like, "Justice, I just came across James Wilson. I can't believe I didn't know who he was, and it's so exciting. I didn't think there were people who talked like this and thought like this at that time." And the justice says, "Well, I of course I know James Wilson," and within 30 seconds of our conversation, I could tell I knew more, and so that was kind of a thrill for me. And I thought, if I know more than a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice about one of the most influential and visionary of the American founders, there's got to be a book in there.
So you mentioned you were really taken by Wilson's background. Could you talk a little bit about his early life and maybe where his kind of, very outside the box thinking might have come from?
So to the extent that that's discernible, the records of his early life are very sparse and in many cases partial. But Wilson grew up in the 1740s and 50s in lowland Scotland. So outside of Edinburgh, he's born into a poor farming family, a very devout Presbyterian family. They have him destined for the ministry. And he does not want that. He very quickly figures out that the world of the intellect and of politics and of law are more alluring. But in the process of getting there, right, he goes to St. Andrews as a 16-year-old or 15-year-old actually on a scholarship in 1757. Those first 15 years, he still is imbued by the circumstances of his time and of his world with a kind of a democratic spirit that I think is unique. It's different from all the other founders and how they were raised. Wilson, he goes to the parish school in Cooper, which is like a 5-mile walk from his house. The schools in Scotland at that time are famously egalitarian, right? They insist on educating everybody, all kids, no matter their station in life. So I think that's one influence on him, of this sense that everybody is equal, everyone deserves an equal shot at the basics of education, and also everyone has the capacity for just basic access to wisdom and discernment of truth. You add on top of that his upbringing in the Presbyterian Church, which I'm not a religious scholar either, but my understanding is the Presbyterian Church is structurally much more democratic than other major churches, such as the Anglican or the Catholic churches, which are more hierarchical. The Presbyterian Church, the congregation elects its leaders. There's this sense of self-government that I think is unique. And Wilson is raised in those waters, right? So this is what he knows, is self-government and equality and participation, right? And then he goes to St. Andrews University, which is actually just a day's walk from his house. And then he goes to the University of Glasgow a little after that. In those experiences, in those settings, he's studying with the people who we know now as the leading lights of the Scottish Enlightenment. So Thomas Reid and Adam Smith, and in the decades before that, David Hume and Francis Hutcheson. And it's just an incredible explosion of, as I'm sure your listeners know, of thought and development of thinking about government and society and economies and all of that. Wilson studies literally with these people. All of the framers know their work. Nobody studied with them directly. So I think when he comes to America, he comes as a 23-year-old. In 1765, he lands in New York Harbor. He is probably one of the best educated people in the colonies at that moment. And he brings with him this wealth of democratic thinking and philosophizing that nobody else really had. His training with Thomas Reid in particular. Reid is the common sense theory, right? That's his primary contribution to the Enlightenment literature. Common sense theory is all about regular people having the same access to wisdom, to truth that that the most well-trained philosopher does. So it's very opposed to maybe a Humean approach to society and to human development, but it's what Wilson connects to, I think, because of his upbringing. So in his early 20s, he's in America and he's got this incredible democratic spirit that pervades the rest of his life through the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and his time on the Supreme Court.
Wonderful. So take us, Jesse, if you could, to the revolutionary movement, the patriot movement. He gets heavily involved in some very important circles. How does a person like him find himself in those situations?
So Wilson goes to Philadelphia soon after arriving in New York. He gets down to Philadelphia. He becomes a tutor in Latin at the College of Philadelphia, later to become University of Pennsylvania. This is Benjamin Franklin's, brainchild. So he's already kind of getting in with the people he needs to get in with. He apprentices in law with John Dickinson, who is at the time obviously a leading lawyer of the colonies. And but that's just gets Wilson access, right? I mean, he brings his own intellect there and his own sort of preternatural skills at political thought and synthesis of politics and philosophy and law. In 1768, he's 26 years old. He writes this essay. It's an 11,000 word disquisition on on his argument is that Britain and the British Parliament has no authority over the colonies, not zero authority over the colonies, right? This is not an argument at that time that anybody else was making publicly. And Wilson's mentor at the College of Philadelphia says to him, don't publish this. You're a young guy. You're about to have a good career in the law. You're going to destroy your career if you try to make an argument this bold. Everyone else accepted to some degree or another British sovereignty over the colonies, right? And they were basically tinkering with the details, right, over the nature of what types of taxes, all the things that everyone here knows. Wilson writes this essay. It's 11,000 words. It's heavily footnoted. It's legally sophisticated. It's historically grounded. And he has to put it in a drawer for 6 years because he's strongly advised to keep it under wraps. In 1774, he has now developed his own legal practice. He's working in in Reading and then in Carlisle, so sort of frontier towns in Pennsylvania. He publishes it in the New York Gazetteer, right, which is a good circulation newspaper in New York City. It runs in 6 installments, and it kind of blows the top off the whole debate over the nature of the relationship between the colonies and Britain. And it's actually, when it is published, it is credited to Benjamin Franklin for reasons that are lost to history, or at least lost to my research. If anyone here knows why Franklin gets the credit for it, I would love to find out. But what we do know is that someone writes a letter to the editor, unsigned, that says, this piece is not by Benjamin Franklin, it's by this Scottish guy, James Wilson. So Wilson really kind of makes his name in the mid-1770s, although that piece comes out after, Jefferson's own summary view, after Mason's Declaration of Rights. It predates those, right? And clearly we know that those guys had read Wilson's work. And in 1776, when Jefferson is sitting down to draft the Declaration and he's looking around for inspiration, we know he has that essay in front of him because he's copied it into his commonplace book. He's copied whole sections of it into his commonplace book. And the lines from the essay that are so sort of evocative, I think, are really worth flagging. Wilson writes in his essay, all men are by nature equal and free. No one has a right to any authority over another without his consent. All lawful government is founded on the consent of those who are subject to it. Such consent was given with a view to ensure and to increase the happiness of the governed. Right? These are ideas which obviously Wilson's not creating them out of whole cloth, but he's synthesizing them in a way that people hadn't yet. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You really can see the connection between them, which has led historians going back to the 1920s to credit Wilson above all with inspiring those words of the preamble. So he's really just, very, very quickly makes himself into a leading political thinker by the time of the Revolution.
So, Jesse, I think you gave us a nice opportunity to move beyond the war a bit to the Confederation period. For me, I think this is where Wilson really starts to shine a little bit. But the Revolution's over. We have a government. It is not perfect by any means. It's got major issues. We don't have a constitution yet. That's not coming for a while. What did you learn about Wilson in this Confederation time period? Certainly he was seeing, this isn't working the way we thought it would right now.
Right. So Wilson, like I said, he comes to America with this spirit of popular sovereignty, this idea that people are the thing that matters. People are the ultimate source of authority in government. So when he starts to see all the sort of jockeying for power by the states as states, right? Not people, but states as political, independent political units, he's kind of flabbergasted. He's an immigrant. I don't think he cares particularly. He doesn't have allegiance to Pennsylvania or any other state. And he can't understand in one of those debates. So he's elected to Congress, right, in the 1770s. He serves in Congress as a delegate from Pennsylvania for several terms. And in one of the debates in the early days of the Articles of Confederation debates, he says, what are we doing here? He's like, how can you give 40,000 people in one state the same power as 10,000 people in another? This must be the effect of magic, not reason, he says. So he's already planting his flag in this sort of popular sovereignty, proportional representation ground, right? And that to me is what was so thrilling about him, was like, I think of proportional representation as this much more modern one person, one vote. But then you go to the one person, one vote cases. Sorry to jump ahead a couple centuries, but when the Supreme Court finally adopts one person, one vote in that series of cases in the 1960s, from Baker v. Carr to Reynolds v. Sims, they're citing for their authority James Wilson, And that was such a thrill. I was like, oh, it's connected. It all carries through. Wilson's ideas are there at the beginning and they're there today. They're there at the moment that we transform American society into the most Wilsonian version of it that has yet existed in 1964. So, he is fed up, but a lot of the guys who serve in the Continental Congress are fed up. They sense its fecklessness. They are well aware of how, in all the ways in which it is not functioning as a proper federal government. So that is what leads to the call for the convention in 1787. But Wilson, I think all through those years, while he is serving, he is making those really essential political connections. He's very invested also at the same time in building his legal career, his legal practice, which is making him one of the wealthier citizens of Philadelphia, which is important for an event that happens in that interim period between the Declaration and the Constitution. But also his land speculation, right? And this is what will ultimately bring him down. It's the sort of the tragic underbelly of his life, but Wilson is addicted to speculating in lands to a degree that none of the other founders are. And all through the 1770s, even as he's serving in Congress, he's kind of at the same time, he's kind of doing backroom deals to make sure that he can buy lands. He's tasked in Congress with negotiating with Indian tribes for land purchases by the government, but at the same time, he's the other delegates are sort of skeptical and they're suspicious of him for doing some self-dealing as well.
Well, Jesse, one of the things I like about your book is you really flesh out Wilson's role and strong voice in shaping, the executive branch. Today, it still affects us so much here in America. Talk a little bit about his perception of authority with the executive branch. There's a little more of the king in there than I think a lot of people realize in terms of the power he has. So people might see that as a contrast.
Yeah.
This is reminiscent of an English king. Tell us about his just general role with shaping our executive branch.
Yeah. So Wilson, yes, I think you're right. He brings a mindset and an understanding to the convention that is kind of foreign to us today. And actually, a number of the framers did. There's this beautiful quote that I include in the book from Rufus King about this. They just conceived of the king and his role in relation to the colonies differently than a lot of the other founders did, than a lot of the next generation did, and then certainly than we do today. But they were not as troubled by the existence of a king. I think for Wilson, the issue was he was good with a very powerful executive, right? He saw the lack of a powerful executive under the Articles as one of its prominent failures. Obviously, that was not his view alone. That was a common view. But Wilson, I think, if not uniquely, then he was one of very few people who was along with, say, Hamilton and a few others, was really in favor of a very powerful executive. The thing for Wilson, and I think what's so essential to understand about his whole conception of government, was that Wilson saw that power as inextricably linked to popular sovereignty, meaning that the king or the president or whatever they wanted to call him could be that powerful only if he were directly elected by his constituents. So that was the way that you maintain that political legitimacy. That was the way that you ensure that popular sovereignty survives, which is that the people get to choose their leader, and they can obviously kick their leader out if they don't like him. If you have such a powerful leader and it's divorced from popular election, that's when you run into trouble. And I think that was why Wilson had fought so strongly early in the convention to get popular election of the president. I think that connection between popular election and a powerful executive was essential in Wilson's mind. He ends up drawing up much of Article 2 as we know it today, the executive branch of the federal government. And in that article, many of the things he pushed for, we see included, which includes, 4-year term, eligible for re-election. And he did not get the popular vote. And obviously that was a big one. When he loses out, when there's crickets in the room, when he proposes it, they say, basically, come back tomorrow, James. Give us something better. So he comes back the next day. I looked around to see where he, if there was some kind of precursor, and maybe someone here watching this will know, but I couldn't find where he had come up specifically with the idea of an electoral college. But the next day in the convention, June 2nd, I believe, he proposes what effectively becomes the electoral college. The debate then goes off the rails. They move on to Congress for the next 2 months. But late in the summer, at the end of the summer in September, these, a group of delegates go off on a subcommittee, and they come up with basically what Wilson had proposed on June 2nd, which is this body of electors interposed between the people and the executive. So, Wilson gets credit for coming up with the very system that he did not want, but he accepts, I think, as in the way of all politically pragmatic people, that better this than, say, Congress choosing the president and the president then being beholden to Congress, or state legislatures choosing the president, which was its own disaster. So, I think I say in the book, he considers it the second most democratic option available.
Jesse, how would you describe his time on the Supreme Court? Because we've had a lot of historians study this. You have this tremendous legal background, which is, I think, one of the strongest points of your book. Tell us about his Supreme Court tenure. How did you interpret that?
So Wilson's Supreme Court tenure is largely unremarkable, with one exception that I'll talk about. It's interesting because the court in that first decade, right, 1789 to 1803, I believe, when Marshall becomes Chief Justice, is sort of still embryonic. It's still finding its role in the larger federal government, and there aren't that many cases to come up to it. The justices are off riding circuit most of the time, so they're not even there at the court. Sessions are canceled, because of lack of a quorum. It's a sort of still forming institution. Wilson had wanted to be Chief Justice. He never was president. This is one of the many reasons that Wilson has disappeared from our founding narrative, despite being so central to it. He never gets to be president, but he sees being Chief Justice as sort of the pinnacle of his own career. He had just helped create the position, literally, by drafting the Constitution. And he's the best lawyer in the country, without question. He gives a series of lectures at the University of Pennsylvania that everybody who's anybody attends. And it's all about he's laying down the groundwork of American law. He sees himself as an American Blackstone, essentially. It's clear to him that he should be the Chief Justice. So he actually writes a letter to Washington that I quote in the book. And he essentially begs Washington to make him Chief Justice. He says, "I think I deserve, it's my job. It's the job for me." And Washington, of course, as you would expect, knowing Washington, says, "No, I'm not going to be influenced in this way. I'm going to choose based entirely on, proper considerations at the time." He ends up not choosing Wilson. And I think one of the reasons, when we read between the lines, is that everyone knows by now that Wilson is having legal problems and financial problems related to his land speculation. And Washington doesn't need another headache at the head of another coordinate branch of government. So he puts John Jay in charge. Wilson is made Associate Justice because it would be weird to keep Wilson off the court entirely, but he keeps him away from the leadership position. And then twice again, Wilson is denied ascension to chief in the 1790s. This is I think a devastating thing for him. I think he doesn't write about it, but I think it's pretty clear that his life really starts going downhill in this time period, in the early 1790s. His land speculation is getting more entangled, and eventually he winds up in debtor's prison while sitting on the Supreme Court. He is the only justice in history to date to see the inside of a jail cell. But during his few years on the court before he goes to jail, he's clearly sees himself as the leading legal mind on the court, and I think that's fair. And the one case that I think is worth calling attention to is Chisholm v. Georgia, which is, I think, 1793. And in that case, Wilson, in writing an opinion that supports the ability of people from other states to sue, from people to sue other states, citizens of one state to sue another state. Wilson expounds on his theory of popular sovereignty. It's all about, right, the people being ultimate sovereigns, not the states, right? So to him, it's very clear that, of course, people should be able to sue another state, which was the subject of that litigation. The states were so mad about this that the day after Chisholm v. Georgia comes down, the 11th Amendment is introduced in Congress. The 11th Amendment being barring citizens from one state from being able to sue another state. And within a few years, the 11th Amendment is ratified and lives in our Constitution today. So the opinion that is the most thorough and fulsome vindication of Wilson's popular sovereignty principles gets eliminated almost the next day. So this was the best he did on the court. Outside of that, there's really not that much to say about his time on the court. I spend a chapter or so on it, but it is, despite his desire for it to be the pinnacle of his life, it is not.
Well, Jesse, we always end the show with the same question. It kind of gets to the heart of what we do here at the Journal of the American Revolution. How do you think your research helps us understand the founding era better?
It's interesting. To me, as I said earlier, I was excited by understanding that the ideas that were in circulation at the founding, not just on the edges, but really at the center, were so much fuller than I had thought. There is the general narrative. I think among the general public, I'm sure that among scholars like you all, that the awareness of the nuances is much higher. But I think in the general public, there is this sense that it was just a bunch of old white guys in wigs arguing about how to keep the American people as far from power as possible. So I was excited at the idea that there was this guy there who is at the center of the entire thing, who literally wrote the first draft of the Constitution, who's trying his damnedest to put the people at the center of the entire story. And he writes the words, "We the people," in the Committee of Detail in the middle of that summer of 1787. Wilson kind of takes the Constitution into his private study and starts writing it up. And he puts things in there that weren't even debated on the floor of the convention. And he puts "We the people" at the beginning of it, right? That's the popular sovereignty bat signal. That's his link to the Declaration of Independence, to "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Wilson is connecting those documents like no other framer, like none of his peers do. And I think that link between the Declaration and the Constitution is, to me, the thing that I am most excited about when I think about Wilson, is that he sees the Declaration as almost supreme over the Constitution in its principle, right? In its popular sovereignty principle. There's no one who talks about this again until really Lincoln, I think, is the first president to explicitly invoke, please tell me if I'm wrong, but I think Lincoln is the first person to explicitly invoke the Declaration as the key founding moment. And he does that in 1863, long after Wilson is gone. It's not even clear he knows who Wilson is at that time. Wilson kind of disappeared from the story until 1840, when Madison's notes become available. But I just think that bringing that kind of energy, that popular sovereignty energy, into the story of the founding was so thrilling to me, and it opened up a whole new, vistas for me when I think about what is the founding, what are the ideas that generated this country, and what are the ideas that continue to be re-invoked as we expand American democracy. So each expansion of American democracy is very Wilsonian, either explicitly or implicitly, all the way through, as I said, the one person, one vote cases. So when we live in a time like today, where I think we're in a pretty significant moment of regression and backsliding, I think we can look back to Wilson again and see all the times in which kind of his vision was that wedge forcing open our democracy, making it a more inclusive and egalitarian system. So that for me is the main reason that I am excited by him and that I wrote the book.
The new book is The Lost Founder, James Wilson and the Forgotten Fight for a People's Constitution. Our guest has been Jesse Wegman. Jesse, great job. I love this book. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can have you back on again someday.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.